Right. So let me tell you, I'll put my cards on the table as where I kind of where my position is. So obviously I'm coming from the Islamic tradition, and actually Islam does have discussions on economics, and obviously zakat is one of the pillars of Islam.
Right.
But in terms of where we stand on this discussion, or where I stand, and maybe many will agree, is so the capitalism, we don't agree with it, but we also don't agree with communism. And so the reason why is because in terms of capitalism, you've talked about the inequality problem and you've talked about the instability problem. For us, I really don't think that there is a push towards an equality of outcome from the Islamic perspective. In other words, and the reason why we have this judgment, or at least I have this judgment, is because of a well-known saying of the Prophet. So basically, some people came to the Prophet Muhammad and they asked him, some people were raising the prices in a market. Okay, so
right.
And so they asked him to basically lower the prices, in which he responded. He said that God is the one who sets the prices. In other words, I'm not going to get myself involved in lowering and increasing prices. So because that's not really, it's not my position. And so from that, there seems to be like a free market kind of understanding from that, obviously demand and supply based, but at the same time there's a redistribution understanding as well because of zakat, and there's 8 recipients of zakat, or 8 categories of recipients. Of them is of the people who basically don't have money, or the faqir, or the one who is impoverished, or right. Those who don't have enough to fulfill their basic needs and so on. But it would seem to me that from this perspective, the economic inequality factor, although is something which is not necessarily desirable, is not something which is seen as immoral from the Islamic perspective, so long as the basic needs of that individual is being met. And in fact, there is a verse in the Quran to that effect, which says, وَجَعَلْنَا بَعْضَكُمْ لِبَعْضٍ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ يَتَّخِذُ بَعْضُكُمْ بَعْضًا سِخْرِيًّا, that we have actually allowed some of you to exceed others in levels, and so you can use, or that they can use other people for employment purposes. You can even, I'm not sure employment would be the right kind of translation, but they can use them for their own advantage, which seems to me to be exactly against what Marx would say, because obviously surplus value, the idea that that the employer-employee relationship is an exploitative one at its core. Basically, this is my understanding of Marxism, that when you have this hierarchy, the employer-employee relationship, then there's an exploitation going on by necessity, almost, because this is surplus value. And so Marxism, for me, seems to say, well, what we need to do is we need to kind of abolish this, so that the hierarchy is eliminated. And it seems to be the assumption from what I'm hearing from you is that the inequality is a bad thing in all cases. And so even when it comes to equality of outcome, we want to achieve equality of outcome. Whereas what it seems to me from reading of my tradition is that equality of outcome is not a desirable objective. And in fact, the burden of proof would be upon the one who's making the claim. So in other words, if someone says equality of outcome is a desirable objective, that everyone should have the same kind of money or the same kind of resources, and there shouldn't be this kind of hierarchical structure of employer-employee, and that is an exploitative one at its core, then the person who's making this claim, it seems to be a very epistemologically heavy claim with many assumptions, would have to prove in the first instance that it is undesirable, that is exploitation, an objectively true exploitation, number one. And number two, that it would be desirable to have equality of outcome. So that it would seem, before we can get to the point of saying inequality is a bad thing, which seems to be like a very general wide thing to say, 2 problems would have to be solved. One of them is, how do you know, or how can you prove that equality of outcome when it comes to economics is a good thing? And how can you prove that the employer-employee relationship, or surplus value, whatever you want to call it, is in fact an exploitative thing at all, from an objective kind of perspective?
Sure. Let me respond, which I think I can. First, a couple of points where we may disagree.
Yeah.
Notice that I tried to stress that there are different interpretations of socialism and Marxism, and as with all great traditions of thinking, there are disagreements and varieties of interpretation.
Yeah.
from the little bit I know about Islam, it's true of that tradition too, that there are differing perspectives on how to read the Quran, how to interpret it, and how to understand the writings and contributions of great thinkers in the Islamic tradition, et cetera, et cetera.
Correct.
And I would guess that some of them are probably closer and some of them are further from the perspective within Marxism that I've tried to argue, number one. Number two, my apologies for the telephone, but it's... okay, number one. Number two, let's be clear. I did not advocate some kind of blanket equality, neither of, quote, opportunity nor, quote, outcome. That's not the issue. The issue would be, if I make myself clear, is that, for example, in an enterprise run democratically, one of the decisions that would be made democratically is what range of difference among the people in an enterprise, including difference in income or wage or salary or whatever words you want, would be appropriate. That is a socially determined and should be democratically determined range of difference. But there is no presumption, or none is needed in the argument I'm making, that they would decide. They might, but there's no presumption that they would have to decide that everybody gets the same. That's usually been, I'm not saying you did this, but usually that kind of image has been used as a bit of a caricature in order to criticize the position. That's not necessary. But let me give you an example of why this idea is important. Over the last 8 months here in the United States, as I said, 300,000 people have died of the COVID-19, and 60 million, a third of our labor force, has had to go into unemployment, during which whatever savings they have were used up, during which they leaned on their family and relatives and friends and neighbors for help at a time when the friends and neighbors weren't able to help them or couldn't do much. And so we've had a massive diminution in the standard of living of at least half our population. At the same time, I'm going to give you one example. Jeffrey Bezos, the owner and CEO of the, just escapes me right now, Amazon Corporation. I assume you know what that is. His personal fortune went from roughly $130 billion to over $200 billion. If we took away $180 billion from this man, we could, by the way, that would leave him with 20 billion, and he would then be among the 100 richest people in this country and in the world. That 180 billion could save the lives and transform the lives of tens of millions of his fellow citizens. That's how capitalism now works. This level of inequality is what this system produces. Just as it produces wealth at one pole, say in Western Europe, and poverty in Africa, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have to tell you that. You know that better than I do.
But what gives us the right to take, for example, with that analogy, what would give us the right to take 180 billion from that man? Like,
the moral imperative that a man who can continue to be among the richest in our community would enable, by that movement of wealth, to do something for the larger community that it has already done for him. He's paying back. The mass of people produced the surplus that gives him that income.
So is that moral imperative premised or in some way predicated by the idea that that level of inequality should not exist within a society? It
may or may not. That's really not relevant here. what you have is a need and a desire on the part of, I don't know, I'll pick a number, 30 million people who could be helped by this, by doing this, on the one hand, and the desire of Mr. Bezos not to have that money taken from him.
Yeah, I get that.
Let me finish. Let me finish.
Yeah.
That's exactly parallel to the fact that there are, I don't know, 2 or 3 million people who work in Amazon warehouses where they are driven like, I've worked there, driven like animals, paid an absurdly low amount of money, which brings them to work only because in this society, if they didn't take that job, they'd be in even worse circumstances. So they take the job knowing that for every hour that they work for Mr. Bezos, they add to the services he sells more value than he pays them in a wage, which is why he hires them. He wouldn't hire them because that's how capitalism works. You never hire a worker unless the worker produces more for you than it costs you to have him come Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. So you are producing a surplus that enriches Mr. Bezos at your expense. Let me finish. Now the question becomes, what does Mr. Bezos do for you? And you know, if Mr. Bezos insists, and if I were advising him, I would tell him this. And by the way, I am advising people like him, and I do tell them what I'm about to tell you. For a good long while, you may get away with this. But a time will come when you won't. And how you act now will determine what happens to you when this imbalance is corrected.
All right. There's a few things there that, once again, it kind of forces me back to the assumptions of the entire project, right? Because once again, we're assuming a few things. We're assuming that $180 billion would be justifiably taken away from him, or that level of inequality should not exist within society. By the way, that's fine. I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with this sentiment. There's actually a verse in the Quran which says, حتى لا تكون دولة بين الأغنياء منكم, so it doesn't become a circulation among the rich among you. So I'm not saying that I agree with capitalism or I agree with money being circulated among the higher echelons of society. But what I am saying is, at what point do we say, well, you have so many ideals here. You talked about democracy. Democracy is one political philosophy. And then you've got liberalism, which says that, property should be protected. And then you have Marxism, which talks about surplus value. If we're in a society which claims to be liberal, in the case of the United Kingdom, and the United States as well, claims to be liberal and it claims to also be democratic, at what point do we prioritize a democratic kind of reasoning, which in this case seems to be, one vote, one person, everyone counts, with a liberal principle, which is that property should be protected? And if we do prioritize one over the other, what allows us or gives us the right to hierarchize, for example, the right for one person to have as much as, say, as another person, which is the democratic side, over another which says that property should be protected and or wealth also should be protected, which is the liberal ethic? Who is responsible for hierarchizing these ideals and coming to different conclusions as a result of it? Because if we say that, let me respond. Otherwise, you accumulate. Your points are all important. It's not that. It's just too many for me to respond. There is no answer to that question. History answers that question. Liberalism is the ideology of capitalism. It says if I can hire you, and I can rip you off by making you produce more value than I pay for you. Look, I could show you, it's easy to do in economics. I could show you that by hiring, let's pick someone, John or Mary, it doesn't matter. By hiring that individual, I now have $50 an hour more goods or services to sell as a capitalist. Someone could say, so what? What's the problem with that?
Let me do it, okay? So I hire you, I have $50 more. because your labor, your use of your brains and your muscle added $50 worth of output that I can sell. And I really appreciate your coming there. And so I'm going to give you half of what you produce. I'm going to give you $25 an hour to show you my appreciation for your giving me $50 worth of output, your labor. Okay? So I'm really happy because I'm getting 50, and in exchange, I'm giving you 25. And the only, and your answer to me would then be, wait a minute, it's my effort, my brains, my muscle, those are finite resources. My labor produces 50. I don't want to be given 25 because I did the work. You didn't, I did. So I want the full value of what I have added to this enterprise's output. And you say to me, sorry, 25 is all you get. And I know that that's going to work because I know that if you don't take this job, the next job you can get will give you 24.
So you're talking really, this is surplus value. You're talking to
absolutely,
us.
Absolutely. And so I just want you to understand from that perspective, what Mr. Bezos is accumulating is the surplus that he squeezes out of millions of employees. That in this way, he's like a pharaoh in ancient Egypt or something with, 10 million slaves or whatever the equivalent would be. And so he can build a pyramid and he can live the way they did, et cetera, et cetera. There is one, I would say, one major difference between the two. The major difference would be that in the case of the Pharaoh or Ramses II, if you want to take the biblical historian seriously on that, whoever it may be that's enslaving populations in the ancient time, with the owner of Amazon, the employees have a choice. They can either get into that contract or they don't have to get into that contract. Whereas in a purely slave type relationship, the choice is not there in the first place. There's no choice at all. It's either you're going to be my slave or you're going to be my slave. There's no third option to that. But with that one, you can either be employed with that surplus in place, or you don't have to be employed with that surplus in place. And then what happens to you?
What happens to you? You have an opportunity to be the one who's setting up the surpluses or being the beneficiary of it by being an employer yourself, wait a minute. The only way you can do that is if you have capital, which is what workers don't have. I don't think that's always true. Like, especially not in today's society where there's some startup businesses and so on that you can start with literally no capital whatsoever. You can start off with an account on in the internet and you can start making money from the beginning, or you can have very limited capital and then literally
just between. Do you actually believe that what you just said? Really?
I think there are many examples of companies, if you look at them, that started with very limited capital, but then continue to be
businesses grow, but that's a different argument. People who start businesses with no capital.
But we're talking about no capital. The person's impoverished. The person's not in a position of any. He doesn't, or she doesn't.
The vast majority of Americans, not only have no capital, but they have negative net worth. That is, the debts they have exceed their assets. They have no capital, and because they have no capital, they can't get access to other people's capital either.
Yeah, so that I would agree with you. I don't think there should be an economy or in a society where there's people with debt. And in fact, one of the recipients, one of the recipients, like from my perspective, the religious perspective, one of the recipients of zakat would be an indebted person. So someone who has what you've just described is negative.
That's what I did. Well, wait a minute. Then you're agreeing with me because that's
on
how
this point. On this point,
I would solve the problem. We would take from Mr. Bezos his 180 billion, or if I had my way, much more than that. But we would take 100. I could compromise. I could compromise. We take 180 billion and we transfer it so that, for example, we eliminate
Yes.
The Jubilee
No,
sector.
just to be clear, I'm not saying that we should not have a robust system of redistribution in an economy. I'm saying that we should have it. I think the 180 billion is we're talking about, 90% tax.
Over the last 40 years, I could show you if you were interested.
With this point, the sentiment here I agree with. Yeah,
but over the last 40 years, we have had a massive redistribution of wealth here in the United States. We have had the undoing of the New Deal. We have erased everything that was accomplished in the 1930s and more so.
With that kind of thing, we don't agree with. Yeah, so I would on that, we agree. Yeah,
with all due respect, the agreement is very nice, but what we needed was social movement to prevent that from happening, and because it didn't, you are now seeing, as I'm sure you will, a movement against capitalism because of the inequality that it continues. Even we have our politicians. Think of it this way. Look at the spectacle. Politicians, left and right, Democrat, Republican, I'm talking the US here, of course, but it's similar in other countries. We have the politicians telling us we all have to work together to get through this pandemic, to get through this health crisis that the world faces, and blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, we're all together fighting this thing. That is, if you pardon me, BS. That's nonsense, because what's underlying that is a continuation of a really radical redistribution of wealth by a system that is not only failing to deal with the public health crisis, but continues, having been already the most unequal capitalism in the world, to become more so.
Yes.
This is
agreed. No, I think the diagnostic.
This is usually what happens when systems are about to crash.
I think that point is definitely true. I think when you're talking about, I guess how I would answer that question from within my own tradition, I would say that it's not about inequality being completely undesirable. It's about the extent to which inequality is undesirable. And I think the extent to which inequality is undesirable from my own tradition is where it leads to people being indebted in the minuses, as you've just mentioned, and or it leads to people not having housing, or it leads to people not having access to medical treatment or the basics. And with that, there should be a robust system of redistribution. And so on that, we do agree, although probably would have different prescriptions. I mean, if we were, in charge or so on. But here's something I would want to ask you. I mean, this is probably one of the defining features of the Islamic system in terms of economics, is the eradication of interest completely.
Right.
Yeah, so that is probably one of the most dramatic things, which any capitalist would be completely against. But this aspect of riba or usury or interest, how would you think, I'm just kind of getting from your experience, how do you think an economy would, or what would you think an economy would look like if we slowly but surely got rid of interest? Would you think it would flatten the boom and bust that you were talking about in the beginning of the segment, where you're talking about 4 to 7 years of boom and bust? Do you reckon that economic depressions will be less pronounced, and at the same time booms will be also flattened out a little bit? What do you think would happen if banks were told they can't charge interest rates, or even or governments and or banks as well?
Well, again, it's one of these decisions. It's like any other market. I mean, I look at interest as there's a market in money, and if you want to borrow money under the current situation, you can do that if you have collateral and if you pay interest and blah, blah, blah. I'm fully aware that both in the Islamic tradition and, for that matter, also in the Christian tradition, there are long periods of time, Middle Ages in Europe, for example, when there was the Roman Catholic Church was dominant, and it prohibited what it called usury, which is basically the charging of interest. And it comes out of a biblical tradition, which says that if another person needs your help, your job as a good Christian is to give that person help. And it is not helpful to demand more back from the person you're helping than you gave them. That undercuts and destroys the whole notion of charity and of giving alms and of being a good Christian, blah, blah, all of that. I understand that. I think, by the way, in the history of capitalism, there have been movements. There are today either to eliminate interest or to radically control interest. For example, among the 50 states here in the United States, there's quite a bit of difference. You cannot charge certain levels of interest in some states that you can charge in others, because there have been social movements that either asked to eliminate interest or to control it. And there are, for example, movements quite strong among students in the United States saying that they shouldn't be charged interest for the loans required nowadays to get a college degree in the United States, and that the debt that they've accumulated should be canceled, either the interest portion of it or even the principal portion of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a contentious issue. I don't think capitalism hangs on it one way or another. There could be alternative ways of allocating capital other than using the interest rate. For me, this is the usual question of the market. And by the way, I'm not familiar enough with Islam to be sure, but I know in the Christian tradition, and I'm no Christian either, but in the Christian tradition, there's an equivalent notion that not only should there be no interest, but that there should, the price of everything, and this may disagree with your quotation from Mohammed from earlier, in the Christian tradition, there's a so-called just price, J-U-S-T, the price of justice, with the justice being derived from the Bible, that something should be priced. By the way, the literature suggests that what is just is that the price should reflect the toil and trouble of the worker who produces the object.
Yeah, Marx will say that would never be the case, right?
Excuse me?
Marx would say that that would never be the case by virtue of the hierarchy in the first place.
Well, it's not so much hierarchy. It's that the system as a whole doesn't function that way. Yeah. But by the way, Marx is, as I understand, very clear that the notion of surplus is not what you referred to earlier as quote unquote an objective or something that has a standard that makes it truer than something else. That's what human beings do. They disagree about how the world works. What a Marxist does, as far as I understand it, is use the theory of surplus and value that comes out of Marx, who in turn got that idea from Smith and Ricardo and the people that preceded him. This is one way of understanding how the world works. It's not the only one. It is always in debate with alternatives, both within the Marxian tradition and outside of it.
Just to ask you on that, wouldn't you say, though, because the Marxism is largely based on historical materialism, that there is a kind of push towards making this as objective as possible?
No. That is for me, again, I am not speaking for all Marxists or anything like that. But in my understanding of Marxism, he is a student of Hegel, his teacher in Germany, and that he made that very clear. And for him, the human community is a group of people who interact with the world in different ways. They dress differently, they sing differently, they eat in a different way, and they think in a different way. And if I asked you the question, which is the right way to eat? With a knife and fork, with your fingers, with chopsticks, you'd react, I hope, and say to me, that's a silly question. There isn't a right way to eat. There are culturally, historically developed alternative ways human beings nourish themselves with food. And I would say, yes, agreed. And there are also different ways they make sense of the world. The Marxist way, I understand, uses the apparatus of surplus to understand the world, and that shapes the political conclusions we come to. But I'm clear that other people have alternative theoretical frameworks. And that's why my sense is that it's history. It's the struggle amongst these alternatives that determines in the context of our historical situation, which of these perspectives grow, thrive, and shape the world, and which of them pass, sort of like human beings. They are born, evolve over time, and die. And this is pretty much what happens to these ways of thinking. And my discussion of capitalism was designed to make the point that what's happening in the larger framework is giving a boost to the Marxian criticism of capitalism at a depth and on a scale I have never seen in the history of the United States, certainly not in my lifetime, but in nothing that I've read about that history either.
By the way, just to comment on something, there is such a thing as a kind of just price as well in the Islamic tradition. In the 83rd chapter of the Quran, there is...
I don't know enough, but I would have expected.
But exploitation is not, once again, it's not the same as, a Marxian surplus understanding where there is this exploitation going on because of by virtue of the system or whatever way you want to put it. But going back to this question of materialism, for me, like when you use historical materialism, it seemed like a push to be scientific in a sense, but there is going to be a point where you move from is to ought. To use kind of like a David Humean dichotomy or distinction. So this is how the world worked, or this is the history of the world. There was, feudalism or slavery, feudalism and capitalism, and then there's going to be communism. This kind of meta-narrative, if you like. This is how it was, but now this is how it ought to be. This is where it becomes moralizing discourse, where it becomes a philosophizing discourse, where you're putting your own kind of morality into it, and this is defined as exploitation, this is defined as just, and this is defined as what should happen or what ought to happen, and there is where why I think the discussion is really the base of Marxism has to be premised on something as solid as possible, and I really do think Marx attempted to do that, but from the is to the ought is where we have a problem, or where we have an issue in terms of really proving that is what exploitation is in any objective way. But if someone says, well, subjective, well, the movement from, okay, this is what happened to this is what ought to happen, then becomes a matter of public opinion. Then really we can't say that minimum wage should be set at this price or that price. Then it becomes a matter of, okay, you're using chopsticks and I'm using knife and fork. It becomes really a matter of aesthetic value judgment.